this shir today. Thank you for joining us. Pareshat Mishpatim. I hope you have your chumash with you. And today's shir is sponsored by Gary and Ella Diamond. It is to commemorate the yahrzeit of Gary's mother, Sarah Rivka Bas Yirmiyahu Kohen. I think yahrzeit on the 1st of Adar, if I'm not mistaken. So that's this coming Shabbos. Neshama should have an aliyah, and may the words of Torah be a benefit for the neshama. And we thank you. We thank you very much for joining. Okay, let's just finish this. Okay. Pareshat Mishpatim, are you ready to study a parsha that relates to the civil law? Where last week we experienced revelation, and we read about an experience that had the impact on the Jewish people for eternity and for the world as well. Now we focus a little bit on our legal system. But the Torah has this very deep desire that we link the two. In other words, just after we read about revelation, we talk about the civil law, interactions in the marketplace, issues that relate to donkeys, to oxen, to lost objects, to damages in the public domain. All that appears in this week's portion. And what's quite fascinating is that the experience at Sinai actually was not completed, because at the end of this week's parsha, there's a detailed description of the events. Again, the nation declaring Naaseh v'nishma makes its appearance at the end of this week's portion. So really, this legal system is placed in the midst of the incredible revelations. That's something we're going to be addressing today. Also, ve'ele hamishpatim. In other words, there's that letter Vav. The Vav is a chibur, it connects. In other words, yes, you just read about the 10 sayings, you read about that incredible event, but remember, ele hamishpatim. So it appears that the Torah is linking that which we're going to read about to the Aseret HaDibrot, to the 10 sayings, also known as the 10 Commandments. We're not comfortable with calling it the 10 Commandments, because as Torah Jews, we believe that there are many, many more commandments. But there is a link between the civil law that we focus on here and the Aseret HaDibrot. And that's what we're going to discuss in the first part of the class. How or what section of the Aseret HaDibrot, what part of the 10 commandments are linked to the civil law that we discuss here. And what we're going to do is we're going to present explanation number 1, where this parsha that talks about the civil law relates to number 10 of the Aseret HaDibrot. And explanation number 2 is going to link the portion that shares many, many details of the civil law to number 1 of the Aseret HaDibrot. So that's what we're going to do for start. Number 10, and then number 1. So, what is the last of the Aseret HaDibrot? Lo tachmod, not to covet. You see something that your neighbor has that you desire. The healthy Torah Jew does not covet it, but rather recognizes what God gave me is what I need. It's what I deserve. It is my toolbox. I have a mission to fulfill in this world. Whatever I get was given to me by God Almighty to focus on that mission. What my neighbor does have, irrelevant. The yacht of 75 meters, not relevant. Yes, it's wonderful and comfortable, and I would not mind sitting in a jacuzzi in the Caribbeans now, drinking some champagne, but if it wasn't given to me, that's okay, because I have something to achieve in this life. I will not covet that which is not mine. Now, that's a very good message, but when you talk about guidance of feelings, these are guidance of feelings, meaning don't feel that what belongs to others should be yours, except that what's yours is yours. That relates to feelings. You need a legal system to tell you what you should feel and what you should not feel. What does that mean exactly? Imagine I have this lawn chair, a nice lawn chair, like here in Canada, those red, they have a name for it, like you go up to Muskoka, or you go up to any of the national parks in Canada.
Adirondack.
And Adirondacks, you see these, that's what they're called, these chairs? So no, you see these chairs in all parks here. I think it's Canada more. I got one, let's say. I don't have one. I don't need it, believe me. But let's say I go to Canadian Tire. That's an appropriate place to find such a thing. And I overpay and I buy one of these chairs and I put it on my lawn and I feel really, really Canadian, eh? In other words, I feel very proud of my Canadian heritage. And I start drinking Canadian beer as a result, and I maybe could even learn to skate, which I've never done and not plan to do. In other words, I feel attachment to this wonderful country as I'm sitting there. Next day, I come out, and guess what? The chair is gone. The chair is gone. Okay, it happens. Not just packages are stolen from front porches. Sometimes even lawn chairs are taken. So I say to myself, wait a second. What do I do? What do I do about it? So I start looking around the neighborhood, and 3 houses down, believe it or not, I spot it, and I know it's mine. I know it's mine. It still has the price tag from Canadian Tire. I identify my chair, and my neighbor is using it. So imagine if I say to myself the following, you know what? I just heard in shul the 10 sayings, and I heard lo tachmod, I shouldn't covet. Right now, my neighbor has it. Since my neighbor has it and he's enjoying it, I shouldn't develop feelings of attachment towards it. I should allow the 10th commandment to inspire me to say, if it is not mine, it's not mine, and move on. I'm a very religious guy for feeling that, right? So it appears I've learned the lesson of lo tachmod. I'm not a very religious, I'm a fool, because if something belongs to you, don't allow emotions to guide you. First, you have to know the law. If something belongs to you, you go ahead and get it back. Call the authorities, figure out a way of getting it back. Don't bring into the picture these guiding words of lo tachmod, don't covet, when it's actually yours. You need to know what's yours and what's not yours before you bring these feelings into the picture. This is what we are told. So comes Rab Ovadia of Sforno, and he tells us the following. Do you want to know why Pareshat Mishpatim is here to guide the Torah Jew how to not violate lo tachmod? Because lo tachmod, not to covet, is not to covet that which is not yours. You must first figure out what is yes yours and what is not yours. And only afterwards can you start working on your emotions. So number 10 is really in great need of Parashat Mishpatim, according to this explanation. This is actually fundamental, very, very fundamental. We've talked often about the Musar movement, about people guided by the disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter on working on your emotions, in emotional attachment to God, in emotional attachment to your essence, and thus work on your personality, become that better person, right? Now, the Musar movement, although it made a tremendous contribution to Judaism, like every general movement had some flaws. And sometimes great rabbis point out the flaws of the movement to be sure that the movement stays in check. One of the rabbis who was critical of aspects of the Musar movement, of people who focus so much on their spiritual, emotional development, knowing self and not giving into temptation and not being jealous of that which belongs to someone else. One of the rabbis who felt that there might be a problem there of emphasizing too much was Rabbi Yeshayahu Karelitz, the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish died late 1953. Really the father, you could call him the father of Haredi Judaism in Israel, which is really not completely fair, because a Chazon Ish was a tremendous, great, and wise man concerned for the welfare of all Jews. And I don't like linking him to a specific movement in Israel that in many ways is very far from what he would preach and teach. But nevertheless, a very influential individual due to his righteousness, due to his tzidkis, due to his personality and his commitment to Torah. And why was the Chazon Ish critical of aspects of the Musar movement? So he notes the following. He shares with us the following scenario. Imagine you have a school, and school is very, very important. You are inspiring children. You are inspiring the next generation. And imagine you have a teacher. You have an old teacher. He's been around for many, many years. You know, when you say the word old, it depends on the industry. It depends on the industry, right? I get very upset, right, when I hear that there's an old quarterback, 43 years old, who won, I don't know, 7 Super Bowls. What do you mean old? He's not old. He's old for football. Don't call a 43-year-old old, please, right? That's a personal thing I have. Every industry, old is different. So you have an old Rebbe, and he really doesn't inspire the kids. He's still from the old school, and he still believes that the stick could be used in the classroom. He doesn't have a love of the children, and it's simply not working. But he has a parnasa, meaning he's living off his paycheck. But the school decides one day, you know what? We have a responsibility to the children. We have a responsibility to the next generation. We're going to hire someone that is younger, and he's new school. You know, he has a Hasidic excitement. He loves the children. He learned a little bit, perhaps, of psychology and an understanding of what inspires the kids. He understands that positive reinforcement could do a lot more than a threat of punishment. And they bring him in. They bring him into the school. And this young Rebbe is a superstar. And although it started off that he was supposed to deal with a small group of kids, the school realizes that these children are flourishing under him. It's incredible. So little by little, they start taking away students from the old school Rebbe. And eventually, he has no job. So people in the community, notes the Chazon Ish, get very upset because this Rebbe has been doing it for decades upon decades, and they're firing him. What kind of chutzpah is that? What kind of chutzpah? And they go ahead and they claim this is not just, this is wrong that the school is doing it. And they start protesting and they start complaining about the school, about the administration. They start complaining about the board. And they make a major tumult. And if you would ask them why you're making a tumult, they would say this is against Torah. You're taking away the parnasa of a Rebbe who's been doing it for 6 decades, right? He's been doing it for 6.5 decades. He's been doing it since he's a 30-year-old. How can you take it away from him? And they start fighting. They start fighting to try to pressure the administration to bring back the old Rebbe. So the Chazon Ish says, if you're going to go ahead and make decisions based on emotions only, in other words, if you're going to only use the Musar way of thinking, that you have to work on your emotions, emotionally, you might think, you know what, this, you know, it's right. The older Rebbe is suffering. Let's bring him back into the picture. But that's not how we make decisions in Judaism. You have to know the law. And the law is that when it comes to teaching the Torah and inspiring the next generation, bring in the most qualified individual. So therefore, if emotion trumps law, and if the focus is only on emotions as the Musar movement does, you could have some serious damage here. If on the other hand, the Jew understands that, yes, there is a need for emotion, but the focus should be law, then you will have success. And this teaching of the Chazon Ish relates to this idea. Jews, you got inspired at Mount Sinai. We want to do good, right? You want to go ahead and be just. You want to create a society where there's justice, but you have to use law and you have to use common sense, right? When it comes to government, you know, we all recognize that it would be wonderful if every person, if the minimum wage would be for every worker at Tim Hortons would be $29. It would be magnificent. Wouldn't it be nice if the kid who just came from the inner city, 19-year-old, no education, couldn't complete high school, wouldn't it be nice if you increase the minimum wage? If you work with emotion, it's something that's easy to sell, right? You could get a bunch of kids going to a We Day conference and yelling, we're going to fix the world. But if you don't look at a bigger picture, you have to analyze how is that going to impact the bigger picture. In other words, it is not enough to just work with emotions. You have to work with law and logic. Welcome to Pareshat Mishpatim. You want to create a society that functions? You want to create a society where there's no lo tachmod, where there's no coveting? Good, but you got to focus on law. And that's the reason Judaism has succeeded. Judaism is around for 3,000 years, not because of people that were just emotionally inspired, but people committed themselves to law. That is explanation number one, how Pareshat Mishpatim, ve'ele mishpatim, the vav that links this portion, the civil law, to the Aseret HaDibrot, links to number 10. So now you have it. Now it's time for explanation number two. Explanation number two is that this portion, and specifically the first details spelled out in this week's portion relate to the first of the 10 sayings. The beginning of this portion has to do with the Jewish slave, the Hebrew slave. Judaism never loved slavery, by the way, but it was in existence, and Judaism had to address it. The Torah had to address it. So what we're going to learn is that this portion, and specifically the first case presented in the portion of the civil law, relates to the first of Aseret HaDibrot. And how is that? So here we go. We are believers that the author of this book of Torah was aware of future challenges that the people of Israel are going to face. And we can actually go through Tanakh, and go through different eras and realize, you know what? That failing that we had during that period of time was actually predicted in the Torah, and the Torah addressed it. The Torah tells us, be careful when you are extremely successful. For example, don't forget God. And then you go through the Tanakh and you realize, yeah, they were successful. They forgot God. So it appears that the author of this work really understood not just the past and present, but rather addressed the future as well. I'm going to argue that to understand who this portion or what era does Pareshat Mishpatim address, right? It really addresses the era of the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, Yirmiyah. We talked about him in the past. Poor guy, he'd had a difficult position. He dealt with some very challenging people. They wanted to throw him into a pit. So I have Rachmanis. I relate to him for technical reasons. I relate to the prophet Yirmiyahu. Maybe Gary also, because it's the name of his grandfather. But Yirmiyahu Hanavi had that difficult, challenging time. What I'm going to tell you is you should know, Parshat Mishpatim, you will realize that this is a parsha that Yirmiyahu most probably told the people over and over again, look at that portion. You people think you're spiritual. You Jews think that because you go to a temple and you bring sacrifices and satisfy the God, so you're okay. It doesn't work like that. That's not Judaism. That's paganism. They are making Jewish practices into pagan practices. Paganism is basically a life where you could do whatever you want, and then Sunday go confess, and then go back to killing on Monday. That's not Judaism. Now, how do I know that Yirmiyahu Hanavi is really the prophet that used this parsha more than anyone else? So I'll give you one example, and then I'll give you another one. Example number one, the Torah tells us that you should know that if a person kills someone else, society has to go ahead and uproot such behavior. And you should know, if someone kills, Me'im mizbechi tikacheno lamut. Even from the altar. In many societies, a killer could get off the hook if he runs into a temple, or if perhaps he's involved in temples, in the service in such a temple. And when authorities knock on the doors of the temple, of this pagan temple, the priest would say, I'm sorry, you can't take him. If you take him, we won't have rain anymore. If you take him, we won't have food because he's working with the gods. People would be released from criminal justice due to their activity in a temple. God forbid Judaism turn into that. And therefore, the Torah tells us that if someone strikes someone else, you got to work on justice. And even if he's in the temple, even if he's holding to the corners of the altar, you take him. Forget about spiritual service. Spiritual service by corrupt people is worthless. That's what Pareshat Mishpatim tells us. And this was a message that was extremely relevant towards the end of the first temple. Because Yirmiyahu Hanavi cries out, you know what? That the people made the temple into a ma'arat pritzim. It's a den of thieves, a den of robbers. That's what the temple turned into. The temple turned into a place where people felt, aha, I'm here, I'm involved in service, I'm a priest, I could do whatever I want. I could kill, I could murder. I'm above the law because I'm a spiritual being, right? And he probably had a beautiful voice, and he could sing chazones, and he most probably could offer a sacrifice like no one else. Maybe he could even give a sermon better than anyone else. But he was a corrupt individual. Viewed others as impediments on his way to success. Yirmiyahu Hanavi cries out, you guys are simply destroying what the temple is about. You're turning it into a den of thieves. You are justifying your lifestyle with the temple. Look at Pareshat Mishpatim. That's not the way to do it. So this is in a case where Yirmiyahu Hanavi is holding this parsha up and telling the people, you have to behave in a specific way. That's not Judaism what you are doing. You're making it pagan, making Judaism pagan. And it's still, unfortunately, we, Baruch Hashem, don't have the corruption that existed in those days. But there are pagan aspects where people justify behavior, which is problematic, based on the fact that they visited a specific rabbi or they wear a string. Like, there are absurdities that we still deal with on a much lower level, but the message is a very relevant one. So with an understanding that the prophet Yirmiyah is the one that really this parsha is addressing more than anything else, that it's that era of corruption that's being addressed. We're going to start off, and this is going to be our main discussion today, is an analysis of chapter 34 of the book of Yirmiyahu. And there's an incredible story there that really will tell us how to look at this week's parsha. Now, what's the story there? We commemorate every year on Asara B'Tevet, the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, which led a year and a half later to the destruction of the first temple. It starts Asara B'Tevet, and it goes for a year and a half, 18 months. Eventually, it's destroyed. What we don't talk about often is that during that period of time, the year and a half, there's a lot of activity in the city. There's a lot of activity. And it appears that Tzidkiyahu, a very weak king, he wasn't in control, that Tzidkiyahu at some point realizes that we have to fix a few things here in Jerusalem. You know, our behavior is problematic. And one area that was identified as a major spiritual flaw was the fact that people held Hebrew slaves way beyond the allowance of the Torah. You have a good slave, you know how it is, how you have a good worker, you have someone that cleans well, and you want to protect them. You don't want to even share with your other friends that you have such a good person because you're afraid they're going to take them away from you. And God forbid that before Pesach you might not have them. So good labor is desirable. It's something we all want. It's very convenient. But to violate what the Torah tells us about treating another human is something we shouldn't be ignoring. They ignored it. They had good Hebrew slaves, and they did not release them. Not after 6 years, not after all the Torah requirements. They kept and they held on to these slaves. And it seemed to be a significant issue. Then there was a siege. So during the siege, Tzidkiyahu the king sees here an opportunity. Because when your city is surrounded, there's less use for slaves. Meaning slaves usually were doing work in the fields. The fields were no longer accessible. So the slaves, people, you could begin the process of a conversation with the slave owner and say, listen here, the Torah tells us you shouldn't be holding them beyond, the allowance of the Torah. Now, another reason why Tzidkiyahu was able to breach this conversation with slave owners was, if you want to defend the city, if a person is owned by someone else, he has nothing to gain by fighting for the master. You release him, emancipation will give people dignity and a purpose to fight, and therefore it would be convenient to protect the city to release slaves. Tzidkiyahu sees this as an opportunity, and after a conversation with slave owners, believe it or not, in chapter 34 of Yirmiyahu, there's some really beautiful news. The beautiful news was that L'shalach ishet avdot, Tzidkiyahu convinces the owners that they're going to release them. And the verse tells us, and this is a very exciting moment, Vayishma'u kol hasarim v'chol ha'am, and they sent their servants free. So this is a great moment, right? Everything is going to get better now. They even made a covenant. They made a pact. The problem was that it appears that right after they freed the slaves, there was a break in the siege. In other words, the Babylonians, for a short time, some historians believe that it occurred in the month of Adar, right? It was year 2, meaning about 5-6 months before the destruction of the temple. Due to some movement of the Egyptian forces, the Babylonian siege was loosened, and people again had a level of access to make their way outside of the city into their fields, and therefore they made a decision to return their slaves. And this is, we are told in the text, Vayeshuvu acharei ken, and afterwards, after doing this incredible act of righteousness, Vayashivu et ha'avadim, they brought them back into servitude, vet hashfachot. And that's when Yirmiyahu has his fit. In other words, you had things going right here. You had things going right. But unfortunately, after setting them free, you brought them back into the picture. In other words, it's interesting. They always talk about slavery south of the border. And you learn about the North and the South. And the North basically was against slavery. And the South believed that slavery is okay. And people sometimes want to believe that the North were the more righteous and enlightened people who understood that it is unethical to own another human being, in essence, and take away any aspect of freedom. And in the South, they were hillbillies and they didn't have those ethics. That has nothing to do with ethics. It has to do with the economy. In the North, there was no cotton. In the South, they had cotton. You need people to work the fields, and it's tremendous manual labor. The only way to do it was with slavery. So it's the economics that guided the ethics. And I see it here too. When slaves seem to be of no benefit, they released them. When suddenly the siege was loosened a little bit, they brought them back in. And here Yirmiyahu Hanavi tells us, you know what? This is a major problem here. This is a major problem. And he tells them, you should know the purpose of the relationship the people of Israel have with the God of Israel, that declaration that he made at Sinai, I am the God who took you out of Egypt. The purpose of that declaration was that every Jew should have his freedom. The Jews should make their decisions and make good decisions. The idea that the institution of slavery is a terrible one, and to use it and to go with it beyond the limited allowance of the Torah, that's destructive. So Yirmiyahu Hanavi cries out to the people, and it's a very fascinating verse that I would like to share with you. And if you see here on the bottom of the page, we are told, Yirmiyahu says, this is in chapter Yirmiyahu, Perek Lamedalet, okay, Perek Lamedalet. So Yirmiyahu says to them, Ko Amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael. And he says to them, listen, Anochi, God says to the people of Israel through Yirmiyahu, Anochi karati brit et avotechem. You know, I made a covenant with your forefathers. Biyom hotzii otam me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim lemor. I took them out of Egypt. I made a covenant with them. And the deal was, okay, you need a slave, fine. But miketz sheva shanim, you don't have that in front of you. But the verse continues, I told you that after 7 years, you are supposed to release your Hebrew slave. And you, on the other hand, ignored it. So you know what's going to happen? As a result, you did not call deror, you did not call the slaves to be free. I'm going to remove my protection from you, and you're going to be a free-for-all, and the sword is going to be chasing you. Meaning, that's it, Jews, you're finished. You are finished. You ignore what I commanded the people of Israel as we developed that relationship at Sinai. So therefore, you're in trouble. Now, the reason I present this verse together with the first of the Aseret HaDibrot, this is the first of the 10 sayings, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. God spoke. I am the God Asher hotetzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim. I took you out of the land of Egypt, out of a house of slaves. Right? This is God speaking. Now look how these two verses correspond. Anochi, hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim. Hotzietoam me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim. Yirmiyahu is using the first of the 10 sayings, the first of the Aseret HaDibrot, to tell the people of Israel, you have to realize the purpose of the Exodus was to make a righteous nation, a mamlechet kohanim, a righteous nation that's here to inspire not just themselves, but to inspire the world. Rule number 1 to be a righteous person, right? What makes a person a righteous person? Number 1, never objectify another person. Another human being, it's a human being. It's not an object. And it's a problem because sometimes when you experience that which is spiritual and you think about God and the unseen entity and you look at your whole life as this journey to get to this destination called Olam Haba, another person is just in your way. Okay, if I could use the other person to get credit, what we call a mitzvah, fine. So I'll give him some tzedakah. But if you take that journey and view others as objects, right? We always share the story of a person who walks in to visit an ill person. And he says, I'm here to fulfill the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And the person laying in bed says, I'm not your lulav. In other words, a lulav you shake. Another person, you don't walk in and say, hi, I'm here to fulfill my mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So it's good you're here because I could go ahead and use you. That's terrible. That's not Judaism. Don't view the other person as an object. And that is what Pareshat Mishpatim is all about. when you realize the other is a human, you are sensitive to his property. And the first portion is to tell you that the worst you could do is make another person a slave. And yes, it existed, and it was a flawed system, and Torah guides you to minimize it. And it was not something the Torah feels as an ideal, but rather the Torah addresses the realities that existed. To objectify another person, right? When people treat colleagues, workers, employees, right? The person bagging things in the supermarket, when he's viewed, when to go ahead and walk into a supermarket and you see someone yelling at the young man or the young lady bagging things and claiming, don't you know that tomatoes don't go on the bottom, right? It's not a machine. This is a person. They have feelings as well. Judaism is here, and Pareshat Mishpatim is all about don't objectify the other. So that's message number one. Message number two is obviously God wants us to be free, not be controlled by others. I should be making my decisions, and I should be making right decisions. The concept of slavery, the concept of owning the other and making them into an object, that is not what Judaism wants. And that's the first statement. I took you out of such an environment. I took you out of an environment of bet avadim, that the whole essence of Egypt was we were owned by others. That's not what I want. Welcome, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, to the being Eved Hashem, a servant of Hashem, but I don't want you to create in Egypt, in the land of Israel. So Parashat Mishpatim, Yirmiyahu Hanavi is telling us, Parashat Mishpatim and the prohibition of misusing the system of the Hebrew slave is what brings forth destruction, that we don't hear this Hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim. And that's why he uses this verse to make his point. Okay, so that's what we have regarding Yirmiyahu Hanavi in Parshat Mishpatim. And what really defines a person of decency is how treating another human. And I think we would all, but one of my favorite stories is, when I flew JetBlue once, I've shared it enough times that I fly JetBlue once. This goes back years ago when there was great excitement in Buffalo that JetBlue was flying. I arrive in JFK, and on the plane, I'm reading a Time magazine article about the CEO. Neiman was his name, I think. And as I get off the plane, Mr. Neiman is standing there with the staff ready to clean the plane. And I was impressed to see the CEO there. And one of the stewardesses noted that she would not work for another company, even if they pay more, because of the way he treats all workers with dignity. Right? You treat people with dignity, right? That defines a person that heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And there's Baruch Hashem many such stories of people that have that sensitivity. I will not objectify the other person. They're not an object. And it's an issue that exists, especially in an era when so much of others are viewed on screen. And people say negative things about others on screen, right? And people could send out a tweet that's nasty. You are besides the fact that you're hurting their feelings, you are objectifying another human. You have not heard message number one. I took you out of Egypt. In Egypt, humans were objectified. They were slaves. There was no difference between the cow, right, and the human. And perhaps there was more respect for the cow than for the human. That's not the Jewish way of doing things. That's what Parshat Mishpatim starts off, and that's really the Jewish journey, right? That's where a person should be machmir more than anything else. So that's message number 1 or 2 or 3 of this week's parsha. But there's another thing I would like to briefly talk about, and that is a verse that appears in chapter 23, verse 14. It's a short verse, so even if you don't have it, you could tune in. Listen carefully. God is introducing the 3 regalim. And God says, I'll quote the verse, Shalosh regalim tachog li bashana. 3 regalim you shall tachog, celebrate throughout the year. And then the Torah spells them out. Chag HaMatzot, right? Chag HaSukkot, Chag HaShavuot. In other words, it's spelled out. But that verse 14 of chapter 23, commentators note, seems not to be adding anything. Meaning, if we're going to be spelling out that you are chogeg on every single one of the chagim, what is being taught with this short verse, Shalosh regalim tachogli bashana? So I'll share with you again an insight from Rab Ovadia of Sforno. And he says the following: Tachog means how to feel. When you enter into the regalim, when you enter into the chagim, be in a state of chagiga, be excited. And he quotes the verse, Yismach Israel be'osav. You know what is a successful Jewish journey? When the Jewish people feel happy with their heritage and their relationship to God. Be happy with what you have. That's the way we succeed. And he adds, the greatest failure of the Jewish journey is to not feel that excitement of what you have, because that's going to lead you to a situation where we find that when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain and saw the Israelites around the golden calf, the worst thing he saw was that they were mecholot, that they were dancing, that they found satisfaction in the pagan practice. So what Sforno tells us is that if we do not find meaning and happiness in our Judaism, and if we just do it because, it's something we do, our parents did it, our teachers perhaps did it, why not? If we don't feel that satisfaction and meaning, you're going to find it somewhere else, and that's going to be problematic. Find excitement and meaning in Judaism. Now, in no way does that mean that we have to all do it the same way. In other words, Simchas Torah. Once upon a time, we would be in Shul, Simchas Torah. There are two types of Jews, right? There are those that at Simchas Torah can dance, for 5 hours straight and feel this a spiritual journey, that they feel connected and meaning in their Judaism. And then there are others that could dance perhaps for 5 minutes and then need to get back to something intellectual and they feel a connection. And I personally don't believe that the only way to do it is we're dancing 5 hours straight. It depends on your personality, right? For me, it doesn't talk to me to dance 5 hours straight. For the Lubavitcher down the hall, it does. It's fine. He is connecting to the Creator his way. I'm connecting my way. That's fine. But what must exist is a satisfaction. There must be that satisfaction. When there's no satisfaction, we see it so much when it comes to children with youth, that a Judaism where it's viewed as a burden, forget it. Why should he continue doing it? Okay, daddy was forced to do it because he had no choice. Why should I? It has to be meaningful. My father used to note that he had a concern. My father interacted a lot with Balei Tshuva. It was the era of Balei Tshuva, right? Late 70s, the early 80s. My father noted that he concerned himself at times what's going to happen with the next generation, because the Balei Tshuva at times were extremely committed with an understanding that I need to do it, otherwise the world will fall apart. But the appreciation he felt was sometimes lacking. And my father, being a Litvisha, always believed that if you go ahead and make your Judaism one that is intellectual and use it as a way of appreciating the world. I think I've shared this story in the past, how it was after the Seder night, it was after midnight, and we had Pesach in Israel. The big excitement was a specific type of Coke that we would drink, that throughout the years we didn't have it. For Pesach, we would have it. So it's after the Seder. And I come to my father with my younger brother. Halachically, is it permissible for us to drink it? Because usually after the Seder, you don't eat anything. You want to retain the flavor of the matzah. And my father's response was, if you want to go ahead and drink Coke, fine. But you have to do the halachic research to figure out if it's permissible or prohibited. So he guided us, and we opened the books, and we went through the reasons why you don't eat or drink after the Haggadah. We analyzed them. And then we came up with a conclusion that after midnight, you could be lenient and drink the Coke. So the result was, and this was a Litvish approach. Why? Number one, we appreciated the Coke. Number two, we appreciated the journey to get to it. This was something that we worked hard. We worked hard a good 15 minutes to figure out that it's mutter. That was the Litvish approach to things. My father viewed that as the excitement. That was for him. And for others, there's excitement with the dancing and with the feeling of getting together as a community when we'll merit that again one day. It has to be with excitement. And that's what we are being told. Shalosh regalim tachogli b'shana. Be sure that when you have the journey of Judaism during Chagim, it should be with a chagiga. It should be with excitement. And part of that at times is as we're beginning the process a little bit thinking about Pesach. I think we're still in the Purim mode, trying to figure out how to deal with Purim during this pandemic. But as we start thinking of Pesach, let's also put effort into being sure that it's a tachog. It should be a chagiga. It should be with excitement. It should be with an appreciation of what we are about. Because when that is lacking, a lot is lacking. When on the other hand, it is one of that appreciation where you enjoy the matzah, enjoy the interaction, enjoys the divrei Torah, enjoy whatever gathering will merit at that time, then we have a successful Jewish journey. Pareshat Mishpatim has a lot to offer us how to live as Jews, and hopefully we could learn and be inspired. We thank our sponsors again, and may the neshama of Sarah Rivka Bas Yirmiyahu HaKohen, which, by the way, Yirmiyahu that we talked about today was also a Kohen, so have an aliyah, so we thank you very, very much.